Solomonster here, and the day after Christmas I had the chance to see The Iron Claw. And if you are a wrestling fan, or if you were a wrestling fan and you know about the Von Erich story, you know what to expect coming into The Iron Claw. You know this is not going to be the feel-good movie of the holiday season. And it isn't. It is every bit as depressing as you would expect it to be. But outside of some bizarre casting choices and the decision to completely omit one of the brothers, I thought the movie was very good. But I feel like it would have been better as a miniseries, spread out over maybe 8 to 10 episodes, as opposed to a standalone movie. Now, it runs over 2 hours, but there just wasn't enough time to dive too deep into any of the characters. Or, if you were hoping for more world-class stuff in the movie, if you are a big wrestling fan, any of the key angles that they were involved in, like the Freebirds heel turn, which is really what set the territory on fire and turned the Von Erichs into rock stars, that is not in this movie. And I get why they couldn't cover all of that, because it wasn't important to the overall story. And believe me, the last thing I want is one long 3.5-hour movie on the Von Erichs. But that's why I think it would have benefited from the TV treatment instead. Kevin Von Erich is the main character that they focus on, which is why the director included him meeting his wife and getting married and having kids. But he did not do that for any of the other brothers, which is what I mean when I say they didn't have the time to flesh out any of the other characters. David was married, Carrie was married, Mike was married. David wasn't just married, he had a daughter with his first wife, and the child died from sudden infant death syndrome. So more tragedy. Plus, there were other circumstances around Carrie's suicide that I think helped better explain why he did what he did, but none of this is mentioned in the movie. Kevin is played by Zac Efron. So to go from High School Musical to this is quite the leap. Now, I have to admit, I don't think I have ever seen, because I went back and I must have seen something that he's been in. I don't think I have seen a single thing that he has been in. I'm aware of who he is, but I've not personally seen him in anything else. So I can't say whether he has done any really serious dramatic roles like this before. If not, that's even more impressive, because I thought he did a great job of making Kevin out to be this really empathetic, character. And I guess given all the guy's been through, it's hard not to have empathy for Kevin Von Erich. But I thought he did a really good job. Holt McCallany from the show Mindhunter plays Fritz Von Erich, and he stole the show as far as the performances went. Efron got super jacked for this role, and I know Kevin was in good shape back in his prime, but not like this. I actually thought Efron would have played a better Kerry than Kevin with that physique. They had Jeremy Allen White playing Kerry, and he's a really good actor, but he's also 5'7". Kerry was 6'2", maybe 6'3". She's not tall enough to be Carrie. Someone coming into this not knowing about the Von Erichs, they wouldn't know that, so they wouldn't really care, but it might bother you if you know what they looked like coming into this, or if you're familiar with the timeline of events, because the movie takes liberties with that too. They showed Carrie winning the NWA World Heavyweight title, and then that same night they cut to a scene of him driving his motorcycle, which led to his accident, even though that didn't happen until 2 years later. You watch this, and you would think it happened right after. Not a huge deal, but that annoyed me. Other casting, they had Chavo Guerrero's in the movie. He's in a few scenes. I know he also gave the actors a crash course in training before they started filming. Gino Hernandez is portrayed in the movie, a couple of brief scenes, played by Ryan Nemeth. MJF is in the movie, as many of you probably know. He plays the fake Von Erich cousin, Lance Von Erich, and supposedly had most of his scene time cut from the movie. The only scene he's in is a non-speaking scene. So imagine casting MJF in a non-speaking role in a movie. But the one scene he's in, there's no reference to who he even is. You just have to... You have to know the story to even know who he is. It's not even really all that important to the scene, which is why they probably cut whatever they filmed with him and they didn't bother explaining it. But he's in the ring, he's in this blonde wig, he's working a tag match with Kevin, and they mainly focus on him not tagging out to Kevin. And that was pretty much it for him. You know what I think? I think MJF should have been cast as Gino Hernandez instead. Fits his personality more. Then there's Ric Flair and Harley Race. And I have to say, the person they had portraying Harley Race, fantastic. When they first cut to him, I thought it was footage of Harley himself. That casting was on point. I have no idea what they were thinking with the Ric Flair casting. That was horrible. It nearly turned the movie from a drama into a comedy. It wasn't even Ric Flair, it was like he was playing a parody of Ric Flair. And not a very good one. So that was atrocious. Thankfully, his role was limited. But it wasn't like it was just one quick scene either. I mean, he was still in there for a little bit, including a full promo, a full backstage promo as Ric Flair. But he is easily the worst part of the entire movie. And honestly, I think that's a credit to the movie if the worst part of it is the casting of one of the minor characters. You could say it's a movie about wrestling. You could say it's a movie about addiction, about suicide. All those things are part of it. It's a movie about brothers and how much they loved each other and looked out for one another and the consequences of the pressure put on them by a very demanding father who seemed to care more about the Von Erichs than he did his sons as actual human beings. Kevin Von Erich, he always, in any interview he's done over the years, he always goes out of his way to praise Fritz and say he was a good father, he was a good man. When you hear enough stories about Fritz, and you see the way things played out with his sons, and the signs that were clearly there and were ignored, and even some of the tasteless things he did as a promoter and angles and stuff like that, Fritz Von Erich was not a good person. As much as I am sure he loved his sons, he was a seriously flawed father figure. After Carrie killed himself, Entertainment Tonight, they did a whole story about not only the suicide, but also the tragedy in the family over the years, and they interviewed Fritz for it. And he claimed he never wanted his boys to follow him into the business. He wanted doctors and lawyers and engineers in the family, but all they ever wanted to do was just follow in his footsteps. Like he didn't have anything to do with that. Like it was all just their choice. For some of them, it may have been, but not for all of them. Fritz is not someone to be celebrated. And to be fair, I don't think people will come away from this movie celebrating Fritz Von Erich. In fact, I would say that if you look at this movie, and rightly or wrongly, every other character in the movie, maybe except the mother, I don't know that the mother is necessarily portrayed in the best light in every scene either, but like the boys and everybody, I would say they're portrayed in a mostly positive light. Fritz is maybe the only one who really isn't. So it's not as if I would say the movie is celebrating him, and nor should he be celebrated. His kids were his meal ticket. They were the key to driving business in his territory and bringing the NWA World Heavyweight title into the family. And in the movie, they make that out to be the end-all be-all for Fritz, right? The title he never had. And damn it, we're going to have a world champion in this family one way or another at any cost. He was trying to recapture his past glory, and I guess some that he himself never had, by living vicariously through his sons. Unfortunately, to their detriment. Jack was the first of the Von Erich boys. They don't talk too much about him in the movie. They do mention the fact that he died very young. They don't say how he died. He's only briefly mentioned. But he was 7 years old. When he touched a live wire while he was playing outside, he got electrocuted. And he fell face down in a puddle of melting snow and he drowned. Right? Pretty horrible. He was the first tragedy of the Von Erich family. And then it was David, who was destined to win the NWA title from Ric Flair, but first came a tour of Japan, only he never got to wrestle on that tour. The night that he got in, he was out eating and drinking, and then he went back to his room, and he was found the next day dead in his hotel room. Now, in the movie, they go with the family story that it was acute enteritis as the official cause of death, which caused his intestines to rupture. And he had been sick in the weeks leading up to his trip. He was vomiting and having all kinds of stomach issues. And all of that could very well be true. Fritz even admitted that before he left, David told him, look, I'm not really feeling well. And Fritz told him, well, you made a commitment over there. You have to go. And so he went. Now, the family has always adamantly denied that it was a drug overdose or that drugs were involved in any way. But most 25-year-olds, they don't drop dead in their hotel room, especially when they come from a family of brothers that clearly had issues with drugs. It's a little too coincidental. There's the story about Bruiser Brody flushing David's supply of Placidil down the toilet. Placidil was used to treat insomnia. it seemed to be the drug of choice with a lot of the brothers. That story about flushing the drugs, that's a story that Brody told to Larry Matisic, who promoted and worked for the St. Louis territory. And Larry was a wrestling historian. He would pop up even on some podcasts and shows in recent years, even right up until his death. I think he passed away 5 or 6 years ago. Very well respected. Brody told Matisic, and Matisic is the one who told Irv Mushnick. Irv Mushnick is the one who wrote the famous Penthouse magazine story on Fritz and his sons back in '88. So that's where that story comes from. And you know, he's hardly the only person to tell the story about drugs being involved and being flushed. Ric Flair in his book said the same thing. Now, Flair wasn't there, but he was told that Brody got into the room after they found David dead, and he made sure all the drugs were flushed before the cops got there because, you know, the boys got to protect the boys, I guess. And look, I mean, why wouldn't people believe that there was something foul about that story? I mean, the family probably gave 2 or 3 different versions of what happened initially. Right? At first, probably to keep kayfabe, they said, oh, he died after taking a hard kick to the stomach during a match on the tour. The only problem is he hadn't wrestled a match on that tour. So that was a lie. Who knows what other lies they told? Once you tell one, it's hard to believe anything else you say. And when Mushnick told Fritz about what Matisic said, about the placidals, Fritz said he would send him a copy of the death certificate from Japan, but then he never sent it. I wonder why. Now look, it's entirely possible that he had some sort of a stomach issue that was, you know, made worse by mixing pills and booze. I don't think he did anything intentional to harm himself like some of his brothers did. Right? There's been other reports that when they entered the room, he had a bottle of Crown Royal in one hand and a bottle of Placidals in the other. I know that there was an old magazine profile on the family where Kevin was interviewed. This was many years ago. And he did say that he has a shot of Crown Royal every year in David's honor on his birthday and on the day of his death. So apparently he was fond of Crown Royal. So that's another version that's been told. Whichever version you choose to believe. And maybe you just take the family's word as gospel. Whatever you choose to believe, we'll never know the full truth. But yes, I think there's more to the story than the family would have people believe. Now, after David died, Fritz turned to Carrie to take his place against Flair at Texas Stadium at what ended up being a David Von Erich tribute show. And that's where Kerry won the NWA title. Then he only held it for 18 days, dropped it back to Flair in Japan, the same place where David died, largely because everybody knew that Kerry had drug problems and he wasn't reliable enough to trust in that spot. I mean, when you're the NWA champion back then, Flair was a machine. I mean, he was doing double shots. He was working 6-7 days a week sometimes. He was crisscrossing the country. You got to be able to make your dates. And he just couldn't be trusted in that spot. He had a lot of problems, even back then, even before his accident. So that's why he was the champion for less than 3 weeks. Mike was the next one to go. He was only 23 years old. He never wanted to be a wrestler, which contradicts what Fritz would have had everybody believe. You know, Mike was more interested in playing music, and they do show that in the movie. He was in a band. But he basically got forced into a spot that he had no business being in. His body couldn't hold up to it. And as they show in the movie, he hurt his shoulder during a match and had to have what should have been a routine surgery to fix it. And then a few days later, he ended up back in the hospital with toxic shock syndrome. His body temperature spiked to 107. His organs started to fail. He lapsed into a coma. The doctors told the family, say your goodbyes. I mean, that's how bleak it looked. Somehow he survived, but he was never the same. And he had no business getting back in the ring, but back he went. 9 months later, he ended up depressed. He started drinking a lot and taking pills. And they don't cover this in the movie, but he got arrested twice for DUI. The second time, they found a bottle of pills in his car. So who knows what that would have led to. So 2 days later, he left a suicide note for his mother. Interesting, it was for his mom, not his dad. He drove out to a lake that the family used to take him to when he was younger. He climbed into a sleeping bag and he overdosed on Placidol. And to his brother Chris, who he was very close with, he left his scuba gear. And inside one of the swimming fins, he left a little bag of Placidol for Chris to take when he was ready to go out. How sad is that? Now, you wouldn't even know that, though, because Chris is not in the movie. He's not even mentioned in this movie. He does not exist. And that's my biggest gripe with the film. Chris Von Erich being left out of a movie about the Von Erich family feels like art imitating life when it comes to Chris Von Erich. You know, and in a movie so heavily focused on one character's love for all of his brothers, right? That really, it comes across, and I think that's what Kevin Von Erich told the actors. I think Jeremy Allen White did an interview on one of the talk shows, and he mentioned that. He said the one thing that Kevin Von Erich told him that he wanted to make sure this movie depicted was how much he loved his brothers. And I thought they did a good job of that. Obviously, that was very important to him. In a movie so heavily focused on that, to leave one of the brothers out like that, it just feels wrong. Now, the director said it was a really difficult decision, but he left Chris out because it would have been too much tragedy for the audience. And because Chris and Mike's characters were very similar, they effectively combined them into one with Mike. The reason for Chris's suicide, though, was the opposite of Mike's. Mike ended up the way he did in part because of the pressure that was put on him and that he put on himself. You know, to do something that he never really wanted to do in the first place. Chris, on the other hand, if you've ever read up on Chris Von Erich, he badly wanted to be a wrestler. He loved it more than any of his brothers did. But he was the smallest out of all of them. He was only 5'5", probably 170 pounds soaking wet. And he suffered from asthma. His bones were very brittle from the medication he was taking. He wrestled anyway. He ended up breaking his elbow. And once he realized that he was never going to be able to carry on the Von Erich legacy, he shot himself in the head. Only 21 years old. Kevin was the one who found him. Now, I understand the director not wanting to overwhelm people with so much grief or wanting to make the movie longer, but even focusing on him briefly and just moving on, maybe giving him the least amount of time out of all the brothers in the film, but still featuring him, it would have been better than omitting him altogether. I mean, I know he's the Von Erich that nobody ever talks about, but it's almost like the kid's life didn't matter. But Carrie was the next to die. He was only 33 when he shot himself. Again, the timeline with him was off in the movie. He didn't have the motorcycle wreck after he won the NWA title. He won that title in 84. The motorcycle accident happened in 86. He drove his motorcycle right into the back of a police car, which is about the worst thing you could do. Almost severed his right foot. He was lucky to be alive after that. You know, people say, oh, he lost his foot in a motorcycle accident. Actually, he didn't. He did not lose his foot in a motorcycle accident. He lost his foot a year later because his father wanted him back in the ring, and maybe he wanted to come back early too, but his father wanted him back in the ring, and he came back too quickly before it had a chance to properly heal, which made the problem worse, and then he had to have his foot amputated. I mean, you hear about that story, and what I would liken it to is, if you're a wrestling fan, you're well aware of Brian Pillman's story. I would liken it to Brian Pillman's Humvee wreck in 96, where he destroyed his ankle. And he was never the same after that. They had to fuse his ankle into one position, and he lived in constant pain, which only made his existing drug problems even worse, because he came back to wrestle when he had no business being in the ring. Same with Kerry. After the accident, he was living in constant pain. I mean, think about it. Imagine wrestling with one foot. You've got that prosthetic and it's constantly digging into your leg, right? Into your flesh. Every time you move, every time you take a bump. I don't know how he did it. I really don't. Well, I mean, I guess drugs, that's how. But I don't know how he did it even for as long as he did. Now, Fritz said Kerry had a drug problem ever since the accident. Nobody knew why, because they swore everybody to secrecy about his foot. Now, some people, like in the wrestling business, some people knew, but the fans didn't know. I mean, there was one night he was wrestling. I mean, the famous story, I think it was Colonel De Beers he was wrestling. And it was not televised, it was never caught on video or anything, but there was one match where his boot came off, and the people saw that he had no foot. And I think he rolled out to the floor and stuck his leg underneath the ring and put the boot back on. But otherwise, it was a mostly well-kept secret at least as far as the fans go. Maybe not so much in the wrestling business. But Gary Hart, who worked for Fritz quite a bit, and he would work for him, and he got fired multiple times and rehired, but he was a staple there in that world-class territory. And Gary Hart told Fritz to his face, because at the time business was not doing so well. He told Fritz, look, we've got to come clean about this. Let's have Kerry say, I fucked up, I paid the price, and now I'm going to overcome this. It would have been this great comeback story, this inspirational story. The fans would get behind him. And Fritz said no. He saw it as a sign of weakness. And he thought the fans would see it that way too, which, as beloved as Kerry was, because to a fault, every time you hear somebody who knew him and worked with him or was friends with him, traveled with him, let alone his own family, talk about Kerry, they don't say a bad thing about him as a person. Oh, he was a mean person, he was a prick, he was this, he was that. It's always about what a easygoing, fun-loving guy. He loved to party, he liked to have fun, but he was also nice and would give you the shirt off his back. The stories you hear about Kerry are largely, positive stories. He was very well-liked. And as beloved as he was, I think it would have rallied the people behind him even more if they knew the real story, that this man was making a comeback with one foot. But that's not how his father saw it. So Kerry ends up signing with Vince. He got his stint as the Texas Tornado. In the movie, there is one scene where they show footage from his actual SummerSlam match with Mr. Perfect, where he won the Intercontinental title. But that was the extent to which they focused on his run there, because again, the story is mostly from Kevin's perspective. It's not about Kerry. If it was a Kerry Von Erich movie, they would have had somebody playing Vince McMahon in the movie. I can only hope that person would do a better job than the person who did Ric Flair. But again, that was not really germane to the story, so they didn't focus on it too much. But Kerry was a mess by this point, and he was constantly strung out. Look, there are matches and promos he did in the WWF. If you go back to 91, 92, actually by 92 he was pretty much gone, but if you go back during that period, it's not hard to tell that he was clearly on something. And by 92, his wife had divorced him and she got custody of the kids. He lost his house, he lost his job. He had tax problems, so the IRS was probably coming after him. He checked into rehab a few times, that didn't work. Then he got hit with 10 years probation for forging prescriptions. And then a few months later, he got charged with cocaine possession, which is never a good thing. It's even worse when you're on probation to get charged with cocaine possession. So he got indicted. It was the 17th of February. This is in 93. He got indicted on the 17th. On the 18th, he was scheduled to be arraigned. He knew he was going to prison. He knew it. His lawyer told him, no, not going to happen, but he was sure he was going to prison. Fact is, he was probably going to prison. And that's when he drove to his dad's house. He found the gun that he had given his dad as a Christmas gift, which they do show in the movie. He gave his dad a hug. He told him he loved him. He went off to go do some thinking. And he shot himself. And in the movie, they show Kevin finding his body, and then Fritz comes running over, and Kevin tackles him and starts choking him and blaming him. In reality, Fritz is the one who found Kerry, not Kevin. But apparently there was an earlier version of the film they tested with audiences where they both discover Kerry's body, and Fritz tells Kevin that he should have died instead of Kerry. Which is ice cold. It's an ice cold thing to say to somebody. But there's that famous quote from Kevin, and it came after Kerry's death. And I think they actually have it at the end of the movie here, or some variation of it. But it's a famous quote, a very sad quote, where Kevin was being interviewed, and he said, "I've always been the older brother. Now I'm not even a brother." That cuts deep. Really does. I should mention there is a scene as well in the movie where Kevin confronts Fritz about cooking the books on their payoffs. This is years later when Kevin took over the promotion, World Class, and he was looking back at his father's books, and Fritz, he doesn't take too kindly to the accusation. The director says they confirmed it through their own research, that Fritz was skimming his son's finances. All those years that he managed them, he was basically stealing from them, which is something I did not know. But like I said, Fritz is not the good guy in this story, nor was he the good guy in real life. It is a movie that will make you angry as much as it makes you sad. But it actually ends on a happy note with Kevin and his kids, Ross and Marshall, who are wrestling now, right? They've been on AEW television recently, playing in the backyard together. Kevin actually has 2 daughters who were born before them, but they're never mentioned. For dramatic purposes at the very end, if you saw the scene, you can see why the director wanted to focus on the 2 boys instead. making parallels to Kevin's own brothers. So at least it doesn't end on a total downer. This idea of the Von Erich curse, it's mentioned in the film by Kevin. And fans have talked about the Von Erich curse for years. I don't know about curses. I think that there's a cause and effect for a lot of the tragedy that we have seen in this family. But when you factor in their first child being electrocuted and drowning, Mike getting toxic shock syndrome, and David's infant daughter dying, I mean, that's a lot for one family to bear. Like, I don't know what's going on there, but it's a little eerie. And we only get part of that story in this movie. It's a story that it just seems too unbelievable. If you didn't know any better, you would think the entire thing is fiction. The entire thing is made up. But it's not. It really happened. Maybe not exactly the way they portray it here, but it did happen. It's a very good film that I think it falls just short of being great. I've had people ask me, how does it compare to The Wrestler? Is it better than The Wrestler? I think The Wrestler is the better movie of the two. The Wrestler, when I watched it and I came out of it, I said, man, that's a great movie. Depressing, like this one, but great. This one I felt was a very good movie that just falls a little bit short of that. But I would go 3.5 out of 5 for The Iron Claw.